back. I'm Dr. Sheik and I'm a licensed clinical psychologist, and today we're going to pick up where we left off in the last video, which is today we're going to talk about how do we set those boundaries. Now that we know that we have to deal with the emotions that come with setting boundaries, now let's focus on how do we set those boundaries? What does it require? Now, what it typically requires above all is for us to be able to communicate clearly and concisely. And I'll enter a video over here or over here somewhere that talks to, or actually points to a video that talks about how do we communicate effectively, the elements that we need to be able to communicate effectively. That will be helpful in this process as well. So how do we set appropriate boundaries with others in our lives? First, we need to understand that the boundaries are for us. How do we figure out what our limits are? How do we decide what behaviors are acceptable to us? What behaviors are deal breakers? What behaviors do we have the cognitive flexibility or the ability to kind of compromise on? Those are things that we have to take into consideration. With that being said, boundaries are not these things where we just sit everyone down and said, this is my list of boundaries. Boundaries tend to come up organically. So they tend to come out of having us encounter behaviors that are problematic for us. So when we find those boundary violations or when we run into behaviors that are problematic for us, then we have the ability to take some time to set the appropriate boundaries. Now, along with them being created or set sometimes organically, boundaries can come out of our previous experiences, and they could be something that we verbalize to people who are new in our lives. What that typically looks like is you're starting a new romantic relationship, you're starting a new friendship, and you're setting out like what your expectations are as far as behaviors are concerned. Like, my expectations are that you are responsive, that you reach out, that you communicate effectively. These are quote unquote boundaries. However, they're not very concise and they're vague. That's just an overview, but we can be very detailed when we're talking about these relationships, whether it's friendships or romantic relationships. I want to reiterate that boundaries sometimes require the ability to have some level of flexibilities. There can be boundaries that are flexible and there can be boundaries that are rigid. Let's give an example. So a boundary that can be flexible is something such as, I don't like for you to bring work home. I don't want you to bring your work home. That can be a boundary, but also that can be a flexible boundary because there may be circumstances or situations where someone has to bring work home or someone has to speak with a coworker at different times of the day or night. Those are different types of situations where those boundaries can be flexible. Now, there are some times where our boundaries need to be very rigid in certain cases. So what a rigid boundary may look like is, I don't like to be touched in certain ways or in certain places for whatever your reasons may be. You may not like certain things done to you that could be both psychologically or physically harmful for you. And those boundaries themselves may be rigid, and that is okay. Now, what does a boundary statement look like? What does it look like when we set boundaries? Caveat, disclaimer. Whenever I'm saying something to you as to how you should say something, I want you to be very clear that you need to learn how to put things into your own words. And the reason why you would want to put things in your own words is that you don't want to sound inauthentic when you're having these conversations. Try putting these things in your own words so they feel more comfortable, so they feel more easily understood by the people who understand you the most, or so that they're able to digest what you're saying. So what does a boundary statement look like? A boundary statement looks like this. It tends to start off with, when you did blank. In that first blank, insert the problematic behavior. What was it that was problematic for you? What behavior did this person display that you did not like, that you did not appreciate, that you want some level of change in? Second part of that is, when you did blank, it made me feel blank. In this second blank, insert how you felt. Insert your emotions, not your partner's or the person you're speaking with assumed emotions, or not your assumptions as to the motives for someone's behaviors. So in this space goes your own emotions and not those that you are assuming are felt by someone else or that you're assuming are the motives for someone else's behaviors. And third is, what do you want to see done differently? What is the compromise? What is it that you're wanting them to do that is maybe the opposite or counter to the previous behavior? So it goes a little like this. When you did blank, it made me feel blank. Next time, can you do blank? And in that third blank, insert that alternative behavior that is more acceptable for you. And this is where we need to have some level level of flexibility. And this is where we need to have some level of compromise, because our boundaries aren't meant to control others' behaviors. Our boundaries are meant for us to learn our emotions and our emotional responses to certain behaviors. When we set boundaries, we're not setting boundaries to make someone else responsible for our emotions. We're setting boundaries so people are clear about how their behavior may or may not have affected us emotionally. Also, it's so that they can be accountable for their behaviors as well. So, what is an example of a boundary statement? And what is not an example of a boundary statement? So, a statement that is not a helpful boundary statement is, when you came home late, 2 hours later than usual, it made me feel like you didn't care about me and that I wasn't important. Next time, can you at least call me and let me know that you're going to be late? Sounds okay, maybe, but also semantics and words matter. In this particular example, someone assuming that how someone behaved is an interpretation of how they felt about them can make the other person feel defensive. So when you're saying something such as, it made me feel like you didn't care, this may cause the person that you're talking to become defensive, because in this moment, you're assuming the purpose of their behaviors. You're assuming the emotions that they feel or they felt, and you're giving them your assumptions. And in those moments, you're making them responsible for your emotions, which in most cases, people will become defensive. On the flip side of that, how you can say that in a way that is more helpful and may have less likelihood to cause someone to become defensive. Again, we have 100% control of ourselves, and we have less control over other individuals. We are able to influence their thoughts and their behaviors, but we can't control them. Now, with that being said, a boundary statement that opposes the one we just talked about would sound a little like this. When you came home 2 hours later than you normally did, it made me feel insecure and unimportant. The next time you're going to be late coming home, can you just give me a call? And your partner may be able to say, if I'm not able to call, can I just send you a text? And that boundary may need some adjustment and it sound a little bit like, okay, if you're going to be late, just give me a call or a text and let me know what's happening. That's how we set boundaries. That's how we remain flexible with our boundaries. And that's how we start to make others accountable for their behaviors, because now it's clear what about that behavior was problematic for you. It's clear about how that behavior affected you emotionally. It's not making any assumptions about how the other person felt, how the other person thought, or the motive behind why they were behaving. And it's also putting into place what alternative or acceptable behavior you feel is acceptable. Sounds very simple, and it's easier said than done, and it requires some level of practice. Again, learn to get comfortable with that guilt associated with you not being able to do something, or you feeling like you are stopping someone from doing something that they want to do, and start to learn what behaviors are acceptable for you, what behaviors can be compromised, and have some level of cognitive flexibility when it comes to being able to set those boundaries. Will everyone respond positively to your boundaries? Probably not. And you get to decide in those moments what you want to do with those who do not want to take into consideration those boundaries. It may not mean that you cut them off completely. It may just mean that you deal with them in certain situations. And in those situations where you are flexible with those boundaries, but learn what those rigid boundaries need to be as opposed to those boundaries that need to have some level of flexibility. As always, this is just an informational video. I encourage you to work with someone on being able to identify those boundaries when you're having a hard time doing it on your own, because sometimes we don't know what we don't know. So sometimes it's helpful to speak with someone who's actually well versed at setting boundaries and understanding, or allowing you or helping you see what behaviors are problematic for you and what behaviors are acceptable for you. So be willing to reach out to those individuals and get that support that's needed. I thank you for taking the time to listen. I hope that this has been helpful. If you have any questions or concerns, please feel free to drop them down below, and I'll be seeing you again very soon. Thank you.